when I went to art school, to RISD in 1988, my intention was actually to study architecture. I was like totally on track to do that. I had won an Architects Institute of America award, competition among high school students my senior year. With the statewide, California statewide, top prize. I had done some blueprint drawings for a friend just to get experience with it for an addition he was putting on his house. Applied with a portfolio of architecture. And RISD has a freshman foundation program where you study, you take 2D design, 3D design, drawing, and then some art history and liberal arts. And then in the middle, they have like a little short winter session where most people dabble in they take a short-term course in the major they're considering. But because I was fully decided on my major, I went and I took like a sculpture course and I think maybe a light metals course. I can't remember exactly, just to get experience in the other departments and get certified to use all the equipment and tools and stuff over the next 3 years of school. But by the middle of my second semester, freshman year, I was freaking out because that's when you declare your major at RISD, is that second semester, because I'd been painting and I'd been drawing and it had sort of rekindled a more sort of pure plastic fascination that I had going all the way back to childhood, with drawing and painting and mark making, basically. And also, I learned a lot more about the department. I learned a little bit more about, the life of an architect, that not all architects design, what the program was like, etc. And I don't know, I just realized that I couldn't process my experience of the world any other way except painting, except mark making. And, turned to my professors at the time and was like, hey, if I study architecture, will I have time to paint? They're like, absolutely not. I said, if I study painting, could I take some courses just, because I'm still interested in the field. And they're like, yeah, maybe, but you're going to get so engrossed that you're probably not going to. And I'd had one teacher my first semester, my drawing teacher, who instead of a final crit, he basically said, okay, you're getting an A. Instead of a crit, we're going to go over to the painting department, and I'm going to walk you through the sophomore and junior studios and just give you a sense of what that life might be like. And then the second semester, I had two really rigorous professors that were almost like grad level intensity in terms of balancing content and form. We literally had grad students that would sit in on our crits because they were so intellectual and intense and stuff. And the two of them were also really encouraging and supportive of me studying painting. But I think what really happened was, I think I had always been interested in art. Apparently, my mom used to tell this story that when I was a little kid, 6, 7 years old or something, I once turned to her and said, someday I hope to do something with my art. I don't know exactly if that's how it happened, but when your parents tell these kind of stories about you, it instills a certain thought in your head in a certain way. And, when I was growing up, I sort of channeled it into things like, I don't know, doing illustrations for the school newsletter, or, for doing photography for the yearbook or whatever. But it wasn't really till I got to RISD that I really sort of got a formal sense of a painting practice. And so everything up to that point was really just experimentation, dabbling. My father is a photographer. So I grew up with him taking black and white photographs. We had a dark room in the basement of our apartment building that he used.
What?
Yeah. And it's funny, I'd kind of forgotten about it. And a few years ago, I was doing a little brush up course on grant writing, and we did this sort of free association exercise, kind of, spontaneous kind of writing exercise. And it all came flooding back, these couple experiences I had with him in the darkroom making photograms.
Yeah.
And I realized that virtually everything I do now as a painter, all these weird, obscure techniques that I've evolved, all trace back to that. Using running water, a kind of alchemical set of processes and steps, dealing with reducing things to basic abstracted silhouettes, simple kind of layering of form, a medium that takes things from one context, abstracts them, and brings them together in ways that they might not ever coexist, but, you know, what's the word? You know, eliciting connections that
Yeah.
you might not ever make. All these things that are so consistent with my work now, in so many ways, trace back to that, and I'd kind of forgotten about it all these years. So
Yeah.
experiences like that, and then my mother became a makeup artist. Um,
Where
and
in California is this? Los Angeles, I'm assuming?
Bay Area around San Francisco.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
we lived in Pasadena for about a year and a half during high school. My dad and an old buddy of his wanted to take a swing at writing a screenplay, and when we were there, we lived in the house of his writing partner's late uncle, who was a sculptor. This is in Sierra Madre, outside of Pasadena, and so all his work was around us. All his work was installed in this kind of garden that he had, this kind of cactus garden, and my bedroom was out in what used to be his studio. So I would walk past all his little clay maquettes and half-finished bronze works and things like that. Um, and then the other really impactful experience was when I was 13. My mother had moved to France to work on her makeup portfolio, be in the fashion business there and stuff.
Mhm.
So my sister and I each took a turn living with her in Paris for 1 year. So when I was at 13, we lived I mean, we were so poor. I mean, she was barely scraping by. She and her boyfriend at the time were both in the fashion business, but, you know, working as expats kind of under the table, and scraping every penny so I could go to this bilingual school. And so, like, but we'd go to the Louvre every Sunday because that's the day it was free, and we'd spend all day there. You know, we'd go to
Wow.
all these great free concerts around town. There was a Marilyn Monroe and Hitchcock Film Festival. You know, so like I'm 13 years old and I'm getting exposed to all this incredible stuff. You
The
know, um,
the world.
but at the same time, because it was all in French and I was slowly learning the language, it was all filtered through this kind of strange abstract translation. So
Yeah.
even though it was my first real deep exposure to, say, Renaissance painting, for example, you know, because it was all, when you're in another country and you don't speak the language, there's a weird sort of filtration that happens. Like everything is just a little bit removed and a little bit abstracted in some ways.
Yeah.
Uh, but it also creates these great little bubbles for you to kind of be immune to the kind of informational penetration and onslaught that happens when you do know the language, you know. So
Mhm.
it was incredibly enriching. I mean, just a profound experience. Um, so all of those things combined, I think, really set me up for where I am now, and being a visual artist as opposed to a designer, for example. Um, but I also realized that, you know, I think the reason I wanted to study architecture is because I had this fantasy in my head that someday I could build myself a house with a studio or something. You know, my grandfathers were both builders. You know, I watched my grandfather on my mom's side, and my grandmother, who was kind of a self-trained architect. She worked in the city planning department in Fremont, and in those days, women couldn't go study architecture, so she kind of taught herself, and she would do all the floor plans for their renovations and changes. They would do stuff for family members and friends and stuff,
Mm.
redesign their garden. So I saw her with her little drafting table on her lap all the time as a kid and was totally intrigued, you know. Um, and then my dad on my grandfather on my dad's side renovated and built this cabin a few hours away from San Francisco that we used to go to as kids. And I was around when they were like digging out the basement and moving rafters way, way, way up 2 stories high and doing all the framing and everything. And I found it incredibly fascinating, you know, just how things come together, how things get built, how things get made, which is, I think, really what my curiosity about architecture was about. It was more about a set of skills and kind of an awareness of like structure and how things are built, than necessarily like wanting to become an architect. You know, I mean, I read Fountainhead and I studied up on Frank Lloyd Wright and all their lives, you know, and all of that. I didn't really have an attachment to any kind of fantasy about a life as an architect, really. I thought I did, but over time, it really wasn't what that motivation or that curiosity was about.
Yeah.
Um, and then my dad became sort of a graphic designer as well. You know, as a photographer, for commercial photographer, he found himself doing a lot of art direction. So eventually he created like his own little one-man ad agency. So he was doing copywriting and graphic design and paste ups and comps and stuff back before computers. And that was around me all the time as well. And all his friends that were in that business, and typesetters and illustrators. And so all of that kind of equipment and the whole vocabulary of that industry, I was around as well.
Yeah.
Which may have had some impact on kind of the graphic nature of my work a little bit, the kind of schematic quality that it has a little bit. And then aspects of sort of just design that go into the way I build my images and compose things, probably that as well.
Yeah.
And I actually did some graphic design, as a day job, for a gallery I worked for, and then later actually started a little two-man firm with a friend who taught at RISD as just like a part-time gig to subsidize painting. I would basically go out to the studio, do a little bit of work in the morning on the client projects and stuff, and then I'd have the rest of the day to paint, while I was waiting for approvals or files or documents or whatever from clients or from a printer or whatever.
Right.
And so I've fallen back on some of those skills off and on over the years to supplement my income and stuff.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Fascinating. I didn't know you grew up in California.
Mhm.
I didn't know you were lauded as this like architecture superstar.
It was just one of those things, I went to it was a public school, but it was like designed as like a prep school for kids that can't afford public prep school. And, you had to like test to get in and stuff. So they had all these great like AP courses and things like if you, were caught up on all your basic studies. So I got to do this really cool architectural drafting course, and I just blasted through it. And because I was tearing through the content so quickly, the teacher was like, why don't you join this other group and submit a design for this project? And and I just threw myself into it and ended up winning this award, which was not by intention. It was just like, oh, this is a cool fun thing to do in addition to playing soccer and learning the SAT test and all the crap you do as a in high school. And
Listen,
Yeah.
as someone who's educated in the middle of nowhere in Arkansas, not all of us in 1994 were learning the SAT.
Well, yeah. I just assume you get one.
Unfortunately, that is certainly what students
Maybe
should be doing, and my kids will do it, but that was not what was drilled into.
Yeah, they had like after school classes. You could stay late for an hour, and they take us through this like workbook, over the course of a semester or something.
Yeah. No, I think certainly there were some kids who were doing that. I mean, my best friend went to Dartmouth and like is a physician now. So I'm sure she was on that track, but that was
Right.
not like, yeah. Yeah. So you do have, I suppose, that being like pretty facile and capable at like these other things. Yeah, I guess like suppose one way to look at it is like, oh, I see how, like you mentioned, these things have informed like the way that I make work, why
Right.
I like to make work and how.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I just chalk it up to life experiences, right? So it's like all these different things we experience in life feed into our work,
Yeah.
ultimately. And sometimes it's really clear how they feed in. Sometimes it's roundabout, but yeah, like, I don't know, when I have to build a stretcher, I'm like really handy at it or whatever, things
Oh,
like that,
listen,
like,
you find it really satisfying when you are fabricating, the fabricating part of being in the studio.
sometimes I'm just I'm anxious to get to the mark making part too, though. It's like, a drudgery. But yeah, I have this side of my brain that can be very systematic and very kind of linear and directed and, sort of highly productive. And it spills over into the painting sometimes. Like if I'm working toward a show or something, it'll feel like there's just all of this kind of vagary and kind of miasma going on in the studio, and then like I'll sort of finish something and then I'll finish something else, and then this kind of momentum takes over, and then like poof, in this short span of even a few months in some cases I'll have like a whole show of work. But and that's partly because of all the groundwork, all the research, all the studies, all of the kind of, you know, accumulation of clippings or, you know, tracings or whatever it is that I'm doing to kind of um, you know, embed my head and embed the practice with content, with imagery and stuff to kind of um, insert or inject into the finished works, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, it's funny, the question about what would you do if you weren't an artist came up. So my last show in Texas at McLean, they wanted to do like a artist talk, and I used to do that with Aaron, who was the, you know, the previous director. So with Aaron gone, Bob was, you know, wanting to be more hands-on and stuff. So he's like, well, we're going to do a talk together. I was like, oh, this will be great. You know, we haven't done that before. You know, he'd come to my studio and we would talk when we'd see each other. But and the first thing he asked was, if you weren't a painter, what would you be doing? And so I talked a little bit about sort of my fascination with architecture in the past, and then he said, we kind of said at the same time, or maybe I would have been an anthropologist. We kind of like almost said it simultaneously.
Hmm.
And then so it was a good jumping off point in a way for the, you know, all the research that goes into the work that I do. You know, and it's funny research though, because it's the academic um, aspect of what I'm researching is sort of secondary to the form. So it's kind of a visual research, and then in the process I learn a lot about all these different objects through history and from all these different cultures and stuff, and then how it all kind of fit together, and like what was happening when, you know, here this was happening over here and that was happening over there, and the way you get it in art history is very linear and very separated.
Yeah.
But in fact, there's all these interesting ways in which things were happening around the world that were infiltrating each other and leaching into each other and osmosis and stuff. And how it all kind of connects is really fascinating to me.
Yeah.
Um, and so this idea about an anthropologist, you know, how all of these symbols from all these different cultures and civilizations have all these underlying sort of basic human connections, almost like archetypal kind of, you know, meaning from one culture to the next, you know, that's something that is really like a connecting thread in my work.
Yeah.
uh,
I can see
and
that.
an abstraction is a way to kind of get at that. So I, you know, I do all this formal research and, you know, going through lots of images and photographs based on kind of an area of a subject or something. um, but then I'm abstracting all these things by silhouetting them, by, you know, cutting out the clippings and using the negative shapes instead of the actual cutouts. And through that abstracting, there's a way to access that underlying connection that kind of
Hmm.
reduces it to more of a symbol or a sign and less of an actual thing with, you know, highly defined characteristics. And suddenly it's easy to free associate more. And in that free associating kind of state, you start to make assumptions about it on the one hand, but then on the other hand, you start to make connections to other things as well, you know, and it's
Yeah.
all kind of subliminally. And so it's like you could have two very disparate imagery from two very disparate sources, even conflicting sources. And subliminally, there's a certain amount of reconciliation that's going on, you know,
Mm-hmm.
despite whatever, you know, historical conflict or friction there might have existed,
Yeah.
which I find kind of fascinating too, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. What you were saying about, well, just visual research and like an anthropological lens. I listened to a interview with Ocean Vuong and Oprah. I'm sure it was part of her like book club. It was like a clip that was sent to me by the algorithm. And he or they were talking about being an artist or being a writer, and how being a writer is really about being a an intense watcher. like kind of an observer without judgment of the world.
Mm.
And that, the writing, like the grammar and all of that stuff they said can be taught and figured out. But the giftedness of being like a not judgmental watcher is like where it's at
Mhm.
for them in terms of writing. And that it sounds like that's also kind of what kind of makes your process deep and wide, and like at this point in your career, probably for others, like so much. Like I think at this point in our careers, it's like, oh, you really want to talk about what we're doing? It's like
Right.
to
Right.
distill 20 years or 30 or 40 of, if you reach back to childhood, like
Right.
it's a lot.
For sure.
Yeah. Yeah. But
The quitting question is kind of an interesting one, because it's sort of hard to quit something that you've always done, and that's something that's so innate. And so,
yeah, that's why it is a question that people ask,
right. And
because it's so hard.
yeah, the question of quitting when I really thought about it after you asked the question, was less about like quitting making marks or quitting painting per se, and more about like quitting how I participate in the world as a visual artist.
Yeah.
You look around at all the different ways artists live, and once in a while I look at some of these artists that are, in a house in Montana in the middle of nowhere, and they kind of have this barrier, this buffer, from the machinations of the art world, so to speak. So they're free to think, they're free to make things, and be somewhat insulated from, if not at the worst, the sort of corrupting forces, quote unquote, which is kind of a mythology anyway, but let's just say there is that end of the spectrum, or corrupting preoccupations or stresses or whatever. But even just, the mechanics of it, and all the different ways in which you kind of have to participate. And I've had fantasies of like living someplace really, really, really inexpensive, and
Come
just
on in. The water's fine.
just making my work and not worrying about, success, and not worrying about, sustainability, and not worrying about all these sort of things that, at the same time, I'm in New York, so I would totally miss all the great people that are in this business, and all the great things there are to see, and this kind of tide that kind of rises and falls and takes you with it, in a way, regardless of whether, you're in some souped up, super high success speedboat type track, or whether you're just bobbing around on a dinghy or something, or even a life preserver, which is how it feels sometimes. There
Yeah.
is this effect of this kind of rising swells in New York that it's hard to quantify, but when you're experiencing it, it's palpable. And it's you can't underestimate the significance of it. You kind of take it for granted a little bit, because we're so fortunate to be so saturated with so many amazing galleries and so many amazing museums, and just so much motion, in the field, all the time. But it's definitely a thing. It's definitely uh, an appeal of being here, So there are trade-offs, obviously. It's super intense to be here, and confronting on so many levels. But yeah, that's about as close as I've gotten to any idea of sort of quitting, so to speak. It would be more like kind of setting up some barriers and removing a little bit from certain aspects of participation, you know.
Sure.
Uh,
Like moving upstate, like the grand
Well,
entire narrative that I
or
think
moving
very
someplace really remote and really quiet, but
true.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. It is funny how much labor, because I am a participant in the New York art world, and it's funny how much I know about the geography of New York and upstate, and how little everyone else knows about like who and where of where I am, and that only matters because I think it's an atypical arrangement in our art culture that it's that one-sided.
Mhm.
So when I think about this question and like all the varied ways I've seen it work out for people, lifelong friends who were born and raised in New York and never left, and all the ways the way it's looked for you coming from California and like answering the siren call of New York through RISD or however that played out. My hope is that it just begins at not throwing out the experience of what New York is for people, but um I just think that there are so many ways to participate that
Yeah.
um, don't look like what it looked like in Ninth Street Women.
Right.
Um, at least that's my hope, that we're kind of getting further to that, further into that. Yeah. I'm glad you haven't quit.
Thank you. Me too. Me too.
And also congratulations to all of us who have not. It's
Yes,
it's
for
a
sure.
lot. It's a lot of like, there's a lot of emotional, spiritual, and like mental wreckage out there if we're on this dinghy.
Right.
And I think just to do it well with as little disrepair as possible is like noted. So if someone hasn't told you that today, well done.
Thank you, Jody. I'll take it. You know,
And
for
thank
sure.
you for
And
sharing.
likewise to you too, honestly. It's there's always this grass is greener thing, of course, that we just do as people. I look at certain friends that are artists in um, regional artistic centers, and they're friends with all the local curators, and they get considered for shows because they really stand out in that region. In New York, there's 250,000 artists, and the curators you're supposed to know are at MoMA and the Whitney and so forth. So it's like there's a certain amount of envy of like, I have a friend who's been in Charleston for many years, and he's like a little local art star there, um, uh, and has a great time. So I don't know, there's just all these sort of different ways. I think the trick for all of us is to have relationships and friendships like this and
Yes.
dialogues like this, and pool our experiences and pool
Yeah.
our access and
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 affirm, like, I
yeah,
made a choice never to live in New York City yet, but
right.
to affirm that is also, yeah, a really hard choice, and it really deserves a lot of like, um, and there's a lot of fortitude it takes to be there. And yeah, I think that is it for me, is to like have that diversity of friends and to affirm each other's
Yeah,
stories.
I think ultimately it leads to the possibility of a more holistic field in a
Yes.
way, where when I come down to visit you in Nashville, I've already been in dialogue with the local curator, and they're like psyched to have a visit. Or when I go down to Dallas, or when I go
Yeah.
back to California, or wherever, and vice versa. When people from all those areas come to New York, it's like, oh, hey, let's get a group together in the studio and do a salon, whatever. Like that would ultimately be the best. That would be ideal.